Syria is a nation in ruin. The rubble in Damascus undulates and is stained with the blood of many innocents who have lost their lives. The Syrian people need justice, but they also need international justice, and they need it urgently. What is set up in this debate? The first is that this court will not be this tribunal will not be convened under ICC auspices because it's a UN organ. It's not an ICC organ. So one, you get less accusatory undertones, but two, you can still get US compliance and US buy-in. It's a bit like the court for Sierra Leone in the 2000s, for example, which put respected legal experts for the region. Secondly, what does this tribunal look like and who is it going to prosecute? I want to note that the tribunal will probably have learned two lessons from the past. The first is from the ICTR in Rwanda, whereby they only tried the Hutus and not the Tutsis. So we've learned from playing to majoritarian tendencies. We will not do this in the status quo. So we have respected local leaders and members from all of Syria's key ethnicities and respected local leaders within the justice system. Second lesson that we have learned is from debarkation in the after the Iraq War, which is to say we can't get rid and fire the entire military and political command. We'll only get rid of the most evil and the most criminally liable leaders while preserving the general political structure as a whole. Second part of setup is why the major stakeholders in Syria will comply. I want to note that al-Sharaa is looking for the fastest path towards stability and to consolidate his regime's legitimacy, and he realizes right now that he's in a precarious position because his own efforts to achieve reconciliation can't really do that, so he will want to buy into this. But secondly, no one and no ethnic group in Syria wants to be the spoiler, so all the major ethnic groups want to forge their own path forward to form a sustainable federalized system or some path of autonomy forward. They also don't want to lose international support, so the Druze doesn't want to lose US and Israeli support. The Kurds want to maintain Turkish support, for example. What will this tribunal do? It will first investigate Assad-era war crimes and prosecute those who are criminally liable, but secondly, to provide clear, definitive closure, justice, and restitution to those that are hurt. Two arguments. One, why this is principally necessary, and two, why this is beneficial for Syrian nation building. Why this is principally necessary? The first principle, and it's a very simple one, is that there should be justice. The Syrian Civil War has led to massive levels of deaths, killings, and human rights abuses. Families are still broken, people will never be found again, but crucially, many of these crimes have not been recognized and justice has not been delivered. Sectarian violence still takes place in Syria and people still lose their lives meaninglessly. Al-Sharaa is still dragging his feet with establishing a secular truth and reconciliation community that doesn't attempt to play to majoritarian tendencies. He's not likely to do this anytime in the future as well. Secondly, there should be international justice because the international community did do a lot for Syria. They took in refugees, 500,000 into Jordan, and because of domestic political backlash, they delivered aid. They deserve to see their efforts play out on the international stage in the form of prosecuting the ringleaders of the conflict. I want to note that justice is delivered in a few ways by this tribunal. The first is clarity of moral clarity and moral blame, definitively singling out the worst abusers and the people who committed the worst war crimes in the regime. Secondly, it probably looks like some level of reparations and restitution using things like international UN resources, but more importantly, the fact that you acknowledge these crimes is in and of itself a form of reparation and restitution. Thirdly, closure, but definitive, long-term, conclusive closure. But more importantly, closure on the larger stage, because that the UN carries a certain weight. It's an international body that is meant to fend for human rights, for universal peace, for universal stability and world peace. It is the highest form of reparations and the highest form of moral clarity and closure that you can get anywhere else in the world. No other body can provide the level of closure. The benefits, therefore, are twofold. People get comfort, succor, closure, and justice. But more importantly, this is just something that is principally right to do, and it should be only conducted on the absolute highest level. Before I move on to why the Sharaa Reconciliation Committee won't work, David.
How do you determine who the most legal individuals are?
I think we have the best legal experts in the region. We have a lot of information. But more importantly, when you convene all of these experts, data scientists, analysts, everyone within this court as a whole, this is when you get the most accuracy, the most transparency, the least amount of opacity to be able to investigate these crimes. The comparative, by the way, on your side of the house is al-Sharaa establishing the committee. I want to talk about why that is awful for a few reasons. There are three reasons why al-Sharaa's Reconciliation Committee won't work, and note that this is a comparative that they probably had to defend. One, al-Sharaa has to play to Sunni majoritarian tendencies to maintain political control. We have already seen this play out, right? His interim constitution mandates that the president has to be a Sunni majority person. His federalized structure to integrate the Kurds into the overall system as a whole hasn't really played out, hasn't worked because distrust him a lot. There's been extrajudicial killings against the allies, against the Druze as a whole. Secondly, violence and sectarian tensions means that no one, but particularly the ethnic groups who suffered under Assad, will buy into al-Sharaa's version of justice and the state-delivered version of justice that their side has to defend. They won't trust a group that's been party to the ethnic strife and a group that attempts to portray itself as the arbiter of domestic justice. But thirdly, I just want to know, it might probably never happen. No more POIs. It is politically inconvenient for Al-Shara to do so because he wants to attract foreign direct investment. He doesn't want to run the risk of inflaming local tensions. Again, he wants to rebuild the economy a bit more quickly. So he's probably not going to do this as well. This means that either A, they get flawed inferior justice on their side, or B, they get no justice at all. Argument 2, this helps Syrian nation building. I want to note that it is still a nation with deep wounds. Sectarian wounds and ethnic groups still deeply distrust one another. I want to note that this tribunal does a few things to facilitate Syrian nation building. One, it removes the worst leaders from the action of delivering justice. I want to note that the most extreme leaders from Al-Shara's militias who killed the Alawites will not be involved in this process. The extremist leaders from the Kurds and the Druze who work with Turkey and Israel respectively will probably not be involved in this process as well. So there's far more willingness to work together to resolve past criminal issues. I think this does a better job in forging a path forward in terms of establishing good legal doctrines and good practices for these groups to work with each other. Secondly, you engage international actors in efforts to reconcile the conflicting ethnic groups. So you get better legal expertise, higher legal expertise, better, fairer, more transparent trial processes that pisses off fewer ethnic groups. Thirdly, you are less likely to engage in extrajudicial crimes and killings in this particular phase because this is when your crimes will get blown up to the largest magnitude. So you don't want to run the risk of being the spoiler. Fourthly, there are downstream impacts to improving local courts. Local courts get assisted as well. Because the more local and regional legal experts take part in this process, the more they absorb these legal doctrines, the more they absorb this trust, and the more they can carry out these forms of justice within the local communities in Syria as well. The more they can set up similar legal structures and principles within Syria and contribute to not only a practically fairer system, but one that's also optically fairer for most individuals within Syria. Fifthly, more backdoor avenues for deliberations to do things like set up social programs, institutions, or at least have plans or blueprints to be able to do so, set up more equitable constitutions and structures moving forward. I want to note 3 impacts and the importance of this. Syria needs to rebuild to be able to build a better life for its future generations and avoid going down into the same cycle of despair and destruction. A more stable and trusting environment towards reconciliation does this, but also it creates more discussion and trust for substantive improvements in governance and setting up equitable structures. Very proud for this.
Mention one thing, you can see microphone here and camera here. If you wish not to be recorded, please state it before your speech, and I hope there is camera operator to take care of this in the case. You can always withdraw your consent after. This is not a stream, I hope, because no one told me. That being said, thank you very much. Happy to be leader of the opposition.
Dinamo Zagreb! Dinamo Zagreb!
Panel ready?
Yes.
Syria has been a bloody, messy conflict fought by multiple groups over the last 15 years. There has been so much death and destruction here that you could not even possibly fathom how much time, effort, and energy, if it would even be possible, to clear up all of these things. Most of the people who have been war crimes are dead and long forgotten. There's so much blood here, it is impossible to untangle this mess. A couple of points with what we will bring to you. First, I'd like to point out that the opening government is in their principle, which is actually a practical, like getting justice as a practical benefit, right? Their entire case is based on the idea that justice will actually occur, right? Their mechanism is we will get experts. One, no idea how these experts work. Secondly, it is not a point about not having enough experts. It is a point that these experts do not possess the knowledge of God of what happened there. To take time and effort and energy, if it would be possible, to find out what happened 10 or 15 years ago. I do not know why their case mechanizes itself or how it exists in the real world, because we get no mechanization for how you actually achieve justice, only wishful thinking. Now, a couple of things that are coming from opening opposition. First, The UN is very inexperienced. The UN has never set up such courts in such a scale and level of capacity for such a long and bloody conflict. Secondly, the UN is probably not going to get the best judges because the judges are going to be politically motivated by member states of the UN. Insofar as the US funding specific groups within the Syrian conflict has interest to push bad judges or biased judges into these courts to not get their allies tried. Russia, similarly so, right? Thirdly, this is extremely expensive. Do you know how much energy and time and effort it takes to pay thousands of salaries for probably a good decade or two to finish up all of the imaging, all of the records, to get all witness testimonies, find all of the bullet casings everywhere, find all of the mass graves, all of the civilians that who fired what, who gave what order, and why. It's extremely expensive to do this. The UN could do much better things with this money. Firstly, on why tribunals are broadly inefficient. And I come from a country that had an international tribunal try for war crimes in the country, and I can tell you that it simply does not work. One, you get a very limited buy-in because no country wants, or no group wants to send the people from their group to actually go and get tried there. Because one, you do not believe that they are war criminals, but second, if they are, you sure as hell don't want them to get convicted. So then, how do you get buy-in? Either you sanction Syria, which goes against what opening opposition wants in the nation-building ideal of it, meaning you tax them money or you withhold things, right? Or you withhold funds, which is what the ICC did in Yugoslavia. Meaning when we were burning down in rubble and people did not have enough to eat, the ICC said, no, fuck you guys. You have to send all of your people, your generals, your beloved people who fought for freedom, and now you have to send them to get tried off somewhere, and or otherwise you do not get food aid. People died because of it. We did not buckle immediately. It took years. Now, secondly, you will still probably not try Bashar al-Assad. Russia is unlikely to extradite him. There is no political incentive for them to do so. They've been giving him refuge despite pressure, and we can't sanction them more than we already have. So simply, this is not going to happen. Right. Cool. The alternative would likely be let the government handle it. However they handle it is probably likely going to be better because the government has an incentive to stabilize to a greater extent. Meaning, if war crimes, to the extent the government has probably the best insight into what specific groups are least likely to rebel. Maybe there is not objective principled justice, but peace in the region is going to tangibly improve the lives of everybody who is actually still alive and everybody who wants to have a prosperity future further on. And it's more likely, the local courts are more likely to try to keep peace between ethnicities to a maximum degree. Meaning they're more likely to know who you're allowed to try, which people are simply not allowed to try. If you do not want a resurgence in the conflict and more people dying, preventing future deaths is a more important principle than avenging past deaths by the virtue of these people are still alive and not dead yet. Cool. Why is this problematic? For a couple of reasons. Firstly, if Bashar is tried, there's going to be a power vacuum. Know that everybody in this conflict either did a shit ton of war crimes, killed innocent civilians, or at the very least is going to get accused of it by the other side. Nobody of the military generals is going to get off without at the very least an accusation. And given that the UN the criminal court does not know which of these accusations are true, they have to check each and every one. That means that you're going to have a huge power vacuum, not only of the top leadership, but like broadly across the spectrum of all political figures. If you're going to say that your principle is justice, but we're going to drag this process over 30 years, like they kind of did in Yugoslavia, and then you wait for leaders to die, like Franjo Tuđman managed to die because his term came up, that's not really a principle of justice that opening government is actually supporting. To that extent, at the point where you create a power vacuum, you're much more increasing the chances that you will reignite ethnic conflicts and war in the region, right? Know that everybody who wants to be in power, factions who did not manage to get in power, are envious of the factions that did manage to get in power. The ultimate end of a civil war is to get political power and political buy-in for you to do the changes that you want to do. The groups that did not get so currently don't have the capital, the political and the military capital to try for it. But if there's a power vacuum, this both gives you more comparative capital to the groups that are in power, but also reignites surges. They think, oh, maybe we could actually win this. Maybe the war is not really over yet. What's up?
The problem is that Syria is not like the Balkans. The UN has been in Syria for many, many years on the UN-DOS border. The UN has sent military interventions into Syria to fight ISIS. They have unique knowledge Al-Shabaab does not.
The UN sent military interventions in Yugoslavia too, and they did not stop Srebrenica, and they were not effective, and they did jack all, and then left claiming that they were peacekeepers. They are bastards who do nothing. Having information of an area does not make you good at trying war criminals in that area just because you sent a few blue helmet boys to look around. They were on a watching tour, not effectively gathering information of war crimes. Long-term hate festers when you do these things. Note that the Serbs and Croats hate each other every single time we get another guy released or tried or put in jail or not put in jail. Right? Because you do not cooperate with groups that you believe are convicted or going to get convicted of killing your loved one. Every time you do this runs through a news cycle, it reignites conflict. Children learn about this. I had to know who Ante Gotovina is. I never wanted to know who Ante Gotovina is. Children born in Syria tomorrow will have to know who is getting tried for war criminals that they will hate because of it. They will feel a sense of injustice, right? And what does this mean for the current leadership? Because they're also going to be put on trial, they have to shift the Overton window to anti-West propaganda, because those are then the keys to power. You have to move over to more anti-Western groups and refuse aid and refuse cooperation, because the only way to realize why you're not going to that court is to explain that this court is illegitimate. And note that at the point where you try these people, they're going to stay in these courts for 10 to 15 years at the very minimum, like every other international criminal court does. You're going to have leave people from the home who may be innocent.
Thank you very much, Leader of the Opposition. Very happy to call the Deputy Prime Minister.
Go. After the Rwandan genocide, the Rwandan government under the RPF carried out a series of trials similar to the ones described by opening opposition. These trials targeted exclusively members of one community, that of the Hutus. Those Hutus fled into the Eastern DRC. They are still in the Eastern DRC today. They are fighting a war in the Eastern DRC today because they believe the only place they can be safe, the only way they can continue to live and exist in their state is to fight back against the Rwandan government, because that Rwandan government betrayed their trust. That insurgency has lasted for 30 years. If this team does what they propose to do, the insurgency in Syria of the Alawites on the coast, of the Druze in the south, will continue for 30 years more. Because do not believe them when they lie and tell you there is a government. The government under al-Shara is a collection of militant groups. When the government carries out trials, when the government carries out organizations and works to work out who did the crimes, that government are militant groups. That government is people who have vendettas and will carry them out. That is far worse than what we support. Let's first talk about compliance. Then I'll talk about Syria's future. Then I'll talk about justice. On compliance, I will deal with some of their silly quibbles on the model here. I'll deal with the rest at the end. The first three silly quibbles on the model I want to deal with are, firstly, they say you will trial al-Shara and that will create the power vacuum. We are not trying al-Shara. Firstly, because of the magic of fiat. Secondly, because of what Rick says, which is that al-Shara and other similar leaders are people we've learned from debathification. We've learned from the ICTY and the ICTR. We've learned from what happened in Cambodia. We will not make the same mistakes again. Secondly, they say factions will surge up and try and use the power vacuum. And I want to make on the specificity of this argumentation. They do not name which faction are going to use this. Will the SDF rise up? No, because the SDF have just lost their power because Öcalan has just tried and a deal with Turkey, so their Turkish backers and the PKK have been removed. Will the SNA fight back? No, because the Turkish government will tell the SNA not to rise up. Will the Druze rise up? No, because obviously the Israeli government has better things to be doing than doing that. Will there be other groups rising up and fighting that? No, none of these groups that they could possibly describe as fighting back are likely to fight back. Plausibly, the only group that are likely to fight back are the Alawites, who were disarmed when they surrendered their weapons in December 2024. They do not describe a group that is likely to fight back. Third thing they say is well, groups are not going to cooperate. Firstly, the vast majority of people we're prosecuting are likely to be the ones who committed the crimes for Assad, because the Syrian Civil War was a war against Assad. They were the ones with the weapons. They were the ones that crossed the red line with the chemical weapons. They were the ones that did the atrocities. Those people are powerless. Those people do not have the resistance to fight back. Those people are unlikely to be able to resent it in that way. But secondly, because they do not cooperate. If people do not cooperate, they lose international backing. And we know how important international backing is to every single actor in this debate. The SDF depend on international backing to ensure that food drops reach northeastern Syria. The SNA depend on Turkish backing for their very weapons. The Druze depend on international backing to keep their area together. None of them want to be the spoiler, because everyone's interest is to make sure that Syria stays together. Every international actor wants to make sure that Syria works. Let's look at the reasons Rick gives for why compliance will be successful, none of which receive response. He gives 6 of them. Firstly, people will trust the members of this international tribunal more than they would trust the Syrians who staff Ahmed al-Shara's reconciliation committees. Those people are not just random international judges. They're people like the people in Jordan who took in 500,000 Syrian refugees. People in Syria have family and friends who've been treated nicely by Jordanians, who've been given support by Jordanians and the Jordanian government. They're people like the Syrian diaspora, which is one of the most successful, one of the most talented diasporas all over the world. There are people in this room that are part of that Syrian diaspora. Those people are able to come in and connect to their local community, do things like develop their legal institutions. Secondly, these peer groups, as I've explained, care far more about international economic concern than squabbling and settling disputes that have been followed over years and years before. Thirdly, what we have is a more visibly multifaceted form of justice, because there's not just one actor carrying out justice. We're going to talk to every single community leader. We're going to go down on the local level and meet with communities, ask them who committed atrocities, ask them to tell their stories. That is far better than one group with one set of tanks and one set of flags flying into your community. Fourth reason it's likely to be complied with. This doesn't interface with other demands and concerns. And that's the real problem with the Ahmed al-Shara Reconciliation Committee. If you are simultaneously negotiating with Ahmed al-Shara for the way that your community should be treated now, and for the way that your community should be treated in the past, that is when you think it is politicized. That is when you think that al-Shara's current considerations are affecting the way he acts in the past. Fifthly, we can do things like talk to community leaders. And sixthly, the reason Syrians will want international community support is because that is what they've been denied. They've been denied the opportunity to leave their country, denied the opportunity to have a government that follows international laws, denied the opportunity to engage in legitimate discussions with the rest of the world. That is what they get. That is why they'll comply. Yes.
So we're not trying him, we're only trying this one particular side that did horrible things, Bashar al-Assad. How is this different from the comparative when the government tries these things?
No, as we've explained, there are people on all sides who've done a number of bad things. The point we have made is those people are unlikely to have weapons, not just because they're part of Assad's government, but also because the communities they are part of are ones that have been forced to demilitarize, like the SNF, like the SNA, like the SDF, like the Druze, like the Alawites. Those groups have been forced to demilitarize. Let's talk about Syria's future. Rick explains 4 things, very little of which received response. Firstly, there's more unity when you have to do day-to-day work. And this is independent of prosecution succeed. Whether or not you actually prosecute people, when people from different communities are working side by side to investigate things, to look into archives, to interview people, they're getting more exposure with each other. They're overcoming the squabbles of the past. Secondly, we remove controversial leaders. And again, we don't need to successfully prosecute them. Just the fact that you might be prosecuted is a reason for community leaders, like the very extremist Druze leaders that ally with Israel, to take themselves off the political scene, to not risk aggravating people, to not risk doing further atrocities and putting their name in the paper. Thirdly, we pacify groups when we get justice. And I know justice doesn't need to be a win or prosecution for you to believe that justice has been done. Because what Syrians are tired of is a government that makes arbitrary decisions, is a government that locks people up for no reason for 20 years in prison. If that means that sometimes the rule of law will mean you can't prosecute someone, I suspect they are smart enough to be fine with it. Because I suspect they know what the alternative looks like and they do not like it. Fourthly, we empower local courts. And this is what happened in Uganda. In Uganda, the International Court Tribunals were able to train up local judges, local prosecutors, local defense attorneys. So every facet of justice in Syria will be able to be improved when they work with the International Court. I would note, this team must defend some other form of justice. That other form of justice, because Syrians scream out for it, and because they say that they will. That form of justice will be worse. It is one that is far more targeted, one that is run by only one group, one that will be far more violent. Let's talk about the success of prosecution. Ricky explains prosecution will be successful. One, because the international community has an enormous amount of expertise, an enormous amount of people who have been to Syria, but also are from Syria, have lived there. Secondly, because we have experience trying war crimes. There are a number of war crimes tribunals being carried out of the past. They say there's not enough judges. That is ludicrous. There are judges whose entire career is serving in various different international war crimes tribunals. Thirdly, we have lots of resources and information for the reason we explained, which is that every group is complying with this organization. So every group has their own records, has their own knowledge that they're likely to disclose in order to make sure that they are not the ones spoiling this operation. Fourthly, because we have victims on the diaspora, victims in the international community who can come forward and tell their stories. They say these judges are inexperienced. Bollocks. Those justices know things. They have experience. They say the judges were politicized by the UN. Obviously not. These judges are international judges. They've spent their time in international communities. They say this is expensive. This cost is nothing compared to the cost that was borne by Syrians. The cost was borne by the millions that died, the millions in the Sulai prison who you saw stumbling out without eyes, without phones, without feet. Those people suffered and we ought pay to provide back for them.
Thank you very much for that speech. Very happy to call it Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Thank you.
say that seriously.
No. After 15 years of what was probably the bloodiest and most complicated conflict we have seen in recent history, Syria now finally has a chance for stability, and this is something that gets ruined by opening government. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why the UN court is not going to be effective. Secondarily, why counterfactual works on our side of the house, and I'm going to have some extraneous benefits. Firstly, why the UN court is not going to be effective. Firstly, this is probably going to be a Western-led court. The problem with this is that West had a lot of, involvement in the Syria conflict. They had their own rebel groups that they were funding. They had their own fractions and groups that they were funding, which means that they're probably going to be incredibly biased. This is something that's going to have incredibly bad optics on all of the victims who were in Syria, of all the victims in Syria, of these specifically groups from the United States of America, right? Because this was not just like something simple. Like these people were committing war crimes, they were raping women, they were killing children, and all these kinds of things, right? So this is not something that, and this is going to look incredibly hypocritical if these groups are not going to get justice, but they're going to go after others. No, thank you. Secondarily, they say, we have legal experts. These are people from the outside, and the problem is that they're incredibly simplistic about how war crimes are happening and things like that, right? Things are incredibly complicated. Like, was your attack self-defense or not? Were you following instructions from higher up? All of these things are incredibly complicated to understand. They just said like, we're going to talk to them. We're going to get multiple perspectives and then we're going to find out the truth. But these are things that are incredibly complicated. Some people, like, the problem with Syria was that like everyone was like fighting for themselves. Everyone was like trying to defend themselves, right? There were multiple different groups and fractions that were fighting against each other. Next, they say like, just because they're international judges, it does not mean that they're bad. Yes, they are. Like, just look at what like failure project of ICC is. It is incredibly it's literally like, it has like bad nicknames like International Caucasian Court because it's only trying like people of color. Literally, they call it like that because like it's only trying people of color and things like that, right? So like obviously like just because you come from like some rappy place, like that does not mean that like some fancy institution, it does not mean that you are going to be good. So that's why we think that these UN courts are not going to be effective. What is the impact of this framing? I do understand that there needs to be justice. Like, I think like out of everyone, we understand like that there needs to be justice for crimes that have been made, like obviously. However, they are not going to achieve this on their side of the house. These are processes that are going to take many, many decades. You're going to be uncovering many, many wounds. You're going to create even more instability because there's going to be more fracturing between these groups after these conflicts are going to start to get uncovered and all these kinds of things, which means that like if this court is ineffective, this is not something that's worth doing. Secondarily, why the counterfactual is sufficient on our side of the house, why internally dealing with crimes is going to be something that is efficient. There are two mechanisms why this is going to be done well. Firstly, current Syrian government has an incentive to create stability. There are still a lot of groups in Syria that have like antagonisms against each other, and they all still have weapons. Like you have Kurds, Alawites, Druze, Sunni, Muslims, all these kinds of groups, right? You want to keep them together and stable. That's why you do not want to, like, how you say, attack a certain group unfairly and all these kinds of things, right? You want to keep stability. Like the Jalani, like the leader who like literally came from Al Qaeda, who is literally on like watchdog for like terrorism and all these kinds of things. He wants to create stability. Secondarily, you do not want to create issues with the West, right? Because right now the problem that Syria has is that they are under sanctions. They do not have good relations. They don't have a lot of investments. They don't have a lot of trade. This is the biggest problem with Syria right now because like people are literally starving, economy is stagnant, and all these kinds of things. You do not want to create further problems, further crackdown, and further insurrections because you want sanctions to be lifted. You want to be admitted into trade organizations and trade groups and all these kinds of things, right? In order to like create prosperity and stability and peace, right? Next thing that that's why I think that like alternative on our side of the house, it's not going to be amazing. We agree that like the process is complicated as well, but it's going to be sufficient enough. And then they say, like UN can train local courts and these kind of things. This can happen on our side of the house as well. Like this is not something that's mutually exclusive. You don't have to have a designated court in order to have UN come in and help you and train you and provide some legal experts and provide legal aid and all these kinds of things. And they have been doing so far, right? So like all these things can exist on our side of the house as well. Closing.
So the problem is that Al-Sharon might want to do good because, as you say, OG agrees with you, most factions that are antithetical to Al-Sharon are very weak. The question is, how does he know who does he need to prosecute?
They do investigation, like everything OG said we can do on our side of the house as well. Like there is investigations, interviews, all these kinds of things, right? Next. What they say about our argument about power vacuum is that like, we're not going to, trial leaders and all these kinds of things. But it's more complicated than this because there are low-level power vacuums that are happening. You are removing military leaders. You are removing very important politicians, bureaucrats from their positions of power. All of this means that there's going to be more creation of instability within the country. But next, there's also going to be more antagonisms between these groups of people because they're going to feel like conflict has been prolonging. Like it hasn't stopped since Assad has been removed from power. It has been prolonging because they're still attacking people from our fractions and all these kinds of things. Next thing that they're saying, no, thank you. Next thing that they're saying is that like there's going to be more unity because we're going to be overcoming the past and all these kinds of things. Guys, investigations of these things are very ugly. It's like not very good. Like you have to like talk to some like fucker from UN who like went to Yale and like talk about your experience of how you were raped, how like someone threw acid in you, like how you say like how you were bombed and all these kinds of things. Like it's not nice, right? And like talking to multiple people about this over and over and over again just makes you relive the trauma and all these kinds of things. So I genuinely don't think that this is something that is worth it. Next, I also want to explain that like their principle is contingent on this working, which I don't think that they have proven. Why do we get better nation building on our side of the house, flipping the argument from the opening government? Firstly, we get more instability because we just like leave the conflict and move on. But secondarily, we think that UN is going to have to, and this is very important, UN has to spend shit ton of money on this, objectively. They say we're going to have a bunch of amazing lawyers and all these kinds of things who are going to do these investigations and all these kinds of things. The problem with this is all of this money from the UN is going to, on our side of the house, can be allocated on more productive things and things that can actually lead to impact. For example, humanitarian aid, development, helping the victims that were there, like dealing with psychological problems and all these kinds of things, facilitating their courts so their courts can actually deal with these issues, not just now during Bashar's, for trialing Bashar's, but in future if some kind of problems happen and all these kinds of things. We think that this allocation of money is something that is significantly going to be better on our side of the house. They don't prove significant enough impact. There is going to be more instability, more money on our side of the house. Please vote all.
We will wait a second for Bob to come back and I will invite If you want to go on like a period of notes or do the setup, you can slowly start. So we will not be prolonging longer. But I will call you officially in public. Woo! But still in public.
Nice weather in Syria today.
One monkey says to the other. The other monkey says, then why don't you add some cold water?
Okay, thank you. So no more monkeys. It's okay. I already called Ayal. I needed to stop my videos.
3. We will prove the ability to catch people who serve as continued and significant threats to security and stability in Syria and the Middle East as a whole. We will meet the burden OO push on OG. They say Al-Sharaa won't comply, and we can't know who's guilty. This disproves OG's case, which means we're going to have an ESL Open final of EUDC, and once we fulfill these burdens, we're going to be in that final. Our case will also matter more than OO's principle of justice, because A, we save lives. They make people feel good. I don't know why that matters. And B, they only get a small amount of justice because they only catch very few people, and they don't catch the people who do all the crimes like on the ground. We are going to catch the most dangerous people, the most instigating and destabilizing people, so we will access our case to a much greater extent. Let's talk first about which groups I think we're going to target. Assad cooperators and ISIS militants who escaped Kurdish prisons in Rojava. Assad consultants and military contractors sent by Iran and the IRGC. And Al-Sharaa allies themselves. Later in my speech, I'll explain why each of these groups is guilty and why they're still active threats. But first, I want to explain why they'd be caught better by the UN than any alternative, why the UN has better knowledge, and why Al-Sharaa cannot do it himself, but will comply with a tribunal. So, starting with the UN having knowledge. They have a lot of knowledge about Syria and about the crime, answering OO's push on not knowing who's actually dangerous and guilty. US intelligence, through the Five Eyes Alliance, through their best-in-the-world satellite system, through their stealth jets and reconnaissance drone, and spiral like Pegasus, and the existence of Israel and the Mossad, the world's best spy overseas independent spy country, who have best-in-class intelligence on the ground across the Middle East, i.e. the Mossad bases in Iran, which let Israel take out the entire Iranian air defense system that they've been spending so much on for so long. The Americans won't share this information directly with Al-Sharaa because the USA, A, fears he will use it against the Druze. B, Israel would hate it if the USA shared their information with a potential enemy who Israel is directly bombing in Damascus. C, the USA maintains a global contract where they only reward their consistent and closest allies with access to their information. Specifically, I want to add another mech here, though. The UN has accumulated immense info in Syria and the US too, given campaigns against ISIS, supporting anti-Assad militias for years, including with troops on the ground training them. The USA doesn't send troops on the ground without deep intelligence gathering. They don't want what happened in Benghazi to happen again. They have profiles on every danger in the region. They know the hiding places, the safe houses, the cooperators and contacts who are connected to the underground leaders that they want to catch. On the comparative, Al-Sharaa is a regional militia who got lucky. He only knows specifically the northwest region, which is his base, and only has very recently began creating networks and contacts outside of it. Why does the UN have the capacity to catch them well? 1, the intelligence I said above. 2, they have access to peacekeeping forces on the ground. They can issue resolutions based on the tribunal. They can man areas that are rife with hideaway guilty people. This is true because the UNDOS, which guards the border between Israel and Syria, which is still disputed, have legal standing to have people there, lots of familiarity with the region, and can easily scale up. Finally, we get to mobilize Al-Sharaa by persuading him to use his forces, not by giving him the information and letting him do with it what he wants, but just telling him, go here and here at this and this time. So, why will Al-Sharaa comply? First, he wants to weaken Iranian Assadist loyalists and ISIS influence. Many of them directly threaten his regime. They have competing claims. They directly fought his militia for years, and they have the capacity to destabilize his regime. On the flip side, managing to weaken these groups is a huge win to solidify his sovereignty and reputation. Secondly, even with his own allies, Al-Sharaa wants to be able to get the West to forgive him. He wants to avoid them launching their own direct retributions within his territory, which would harm his sovereignty and make him seem weak. Now he gets to negotiate. I'll only give you hundreds of people from my allies rather than thousands. He can frame it as a victory. He's protecting the vast majority of his allies while cooperating with the United States. It's a win-win for Syria and for his allies. Finally, he knows that the UN DOS pressure towards Israel is based on their compliance with UN demands. He wants to maintain it so that Israel can't invade Syrian territory, specifically in Druze majority Sueda, which has massive impetus, political impetus in Israel, and clearly answers Israel's incentives to have a depth of hills. That's why Israel likes various territories. Okay, al-Shara can't do this himself. One, he is Sunni Muslim. He cannot afford to antagonize the parts of the population that are Maronite, Kurds, Shiite, or Druze. This cross applies to the areas that have the most criminals. Now, he has a clear excuse. I'm capturing people according to UN demands later. For his allies, he definitely can't do it himself. He would lose their loyalty if he cracked down on his own accord. But under immense UN pressure, he can say he has no choice. And anyway, hundreds would be caught. And he's saving the thousands that he makes sure aren't caught. Finally, without information from the West, he doesn't have the proof. He doesn't have the justification. He doesn't have the focus. He doesn't know where the hideouts are and where to attack and focus. Before I explain why each of these groups is guilty and are still acting threats, opening.
You have a group of allies and they know that 10% of them are going to get sent to a prison for life. Nobody has an incentive to cooperate. You're creating more internal struggles.
But it's not 10%. There are millions of people belonging to the ethnic groups that al-Shara is allied with. Tens of thousands have been combatants. We think we're going to capture hundreds. I absolutely don't think that's correct. Let's explain for each group now why they're guilty and why they're active threats. I want to start with Iranians, Assad consultants, and traders. Why are they guilty? They supported Assad and his terrible dictatorship. They enabled the horrible conditions in his death camp prisons. The IRGC directly did the toxic bombings, the bioweapons of mass destructions on Syrian cities that launched at the start of the Civil War. And note that for the last decade, they've directly upheld the Syrian regime. They have been the main fighting force. Iran and their proxy Hezbollah replaced the Syrian military as the main fighting force long ago. This is why Syria was ripe for the taking for al-Shara the moment Iran and Hezbollah had to pull back. Second, why are they problematic and dangerous people? Note, they're still present in Syria. There's still more anarchy there. It's easier to not get caught there. It's easier to cause tensions there. Many of them were held in Rojava prisons. During the retreat of the Kurds late in the Civil War, many of these prisoners got freed. These people will either attempt to maintain the anarchy in Syria and destabilize it, or they will move to Iraq to aid Iranian or to Lebanon to advise and train Hezbollah or other Iranian-backed proxies there. When we catch them, we significantly harm Iran's ability to rehabilitate its proxies in the region, which is the greatest destabilizer in the region for years. Second, ISIS. Rojava's assimilation into Syria meant that lots of ISIS assailants who have escaped into the hills of Rojava after being freed from Kurdish prisons when Kurdish positions were abandoned and the SDF have to leave there, are still there. Why they're guilty? They're ISIS guys. The beheadings, the slave camps, like you know this. Why are they dangerous? Because they still infiltrate other countries. They're still radical Islamists who believe their past successes and glory can be reachieved. Brutal people have been compelled and accustomed to doing terrible things, and they still appeal to a sector of society. That is why there are ISIS branches all over the world. Finally, al-Shara's allies. Many of them are guilty because they are violent ethnic militias who managed to not only survive the Civil War, but become strong enough that al-Shara was unable to beat them into submission, but had to ally with them in order to persuade them to join the new regime. They can compromise and we can capture them now. People who have been, note, Trump has an easier time compromising with Syria if they give up the worst of people. He doesn't have to ask for the rest. Many ex-terrorists have moderated over time into governors and we'll be fine with keeping them. But the most dangerous ones, the ones who still do the crimes according to US intelligence, those will demand. And for all those reasons, go with closing.
Thank you very much for that speech, and very happy to call the member of the opposition. Thank you very much for that speech, and very happy to call the government whip.
Three, two, one.
There are two simple clashes. The first is the accuracy of the international tribunal relative to a domestic one in Syria, and the second is the effects of a legal action in Syria. Ayal's extension is very simple. It proves an asymmetry on that first clash through the capacity to get information, which I will now benefit by symmetricizing OO's idea on the incentives of the UN to act well. And the second thing that Ayal does is by proving a population of people that ought to be prosecuted that is more impactful than any population that the top half teams discuss.
First clash, accuracy of the tribunal relative to regional tribunals. Opening opposition's claim here is that, and I want you to note, fewfold. A few things that OG does engage with, but there's one central thing that OG misses in opening opposition, which is that the fact that you have good legal experts that went to Yale, as Paula says, doesn't mean that you understand who is guilty on the ground. Opening government just says you are good legally. They don't explain why you resolve the information problems that OO point out. We explain why it is not only that you solve these information problems, but that they're greater on your side of the house. I want to make it very clear why the intelligence that Ayal explains makes and resolves the questions about who is guilty. The Mossad and the UNDOS have accumulated massive amounts of information generationally about groups in Syria and about crimes committed. They've done this through, one, the UNDOS spreading a lot of peacekeepers around Syria in order to communicate with local communities and entrench and gather information in amateur ways. Secondly, they have done this through Mossad targeting and wanting to know about specific crises and targeted assassinations and disasters that have happened across Syria in order to know power balances within Syria and within the fight between different factions. This means that knowing who was where and who did what is essential only through Western intelligence, which will not be given to Al-Sharaa. Let's symmetricize incentives. They say the UN wants to act badly and they want to act with impunity and over-prosecute. Problem, the UN investigation and tribunal will be led by US interests. This is because the US is the one with the strongest interest in the region. They're the ones that are able to have Syria be a buffer zone between Iran and rebuilding Hezbollah in Lebanon, as well as the fact that they could protect through Syria a lot of strikes coming Israel's way, which rebukes escalations with Iran. The reason that that's really important is because the US wants to strike an accurate balance. Remove too much and you lustrate the Al-Sharaa regime, you make it not administratively functional, and you antagonize populations, as opening opposition themselves say, in a way that likely means you re-spiral into a conflict. But do too little and you still create distrust in Al-Sharaa, because there are still Assad assailants, there are still bad people that are in place and populations distrust him, and because he might realign with Assad with Iranian incentives. So the US wants to strike exactly the ones who ought to be prosecuted, who ought to be criminal. Notice how much leverage the US has over this tribunal. The US, as Ayal explains, is the one that sees the information. It's the one that decides what to give. It's the one that shows the UN who and where they have legal cause to prosecute, which is why this good incentive means they prosecute well. Regional tribunal does not have this incentive. I want to now point out what it is that I think OG missed, even on the question of prosecuting bad people. They say the problem with the Al-Sharaa comparative is that you over-prosecute and you're too brutal. Problem. DPM says themselves in symmetricizing OO, there are very few people in Syria that are actually still Assad supporters. So what is OG saying? Is it that Al-Sharaa will be too soft? Or is it, as DPM says to OO, that Al-Sharaa will be too hard? At the very least, it's presumable that Al-Sharaa would, on opposition side after OG, prosecute at least the most important people, those who did the most horrors in order to create trust. Compare this with the asymmetry reproof. When people get into prisons in Rojava and you have no information about where they are because they're embedded into villages in East Syria, these might be mass murderers. These might be people that knew how to escalate and instigate prison escapes. Those are the ones that Al-Sharaa wants to capture on both sides of the house, but cannot on their side. Closing opposition very quickly. They say you have a lot of incentive because many people really, really like and are united in the opposition. This is why their domestic tribunal will work. This nudges opening opposition, which says that many local communities are extremely antagonized to this move. Secondly, they say that it's bad to launch a military campaign. Clearly, if we're able to remove the strategic problems in Syria, if we're able to remove ISIS assailants, that means US support and humanitarian aid increases massively. I'm very sorry for this way, but one terrorist kills 10 people, and killing one terrorist is one person, not to mention the additional aid we get from US support. We're willing to sacrifice more military interventions for this. Second clash, what happens due to the tribunal? Both OO and CO have the following conception. You are going to crack down on local communities because many local communities, and there's an asymmetry and instability created because you have to take out political leaders. This is where spec is really useful, guys. This is the most insane case in Syria's context. Before I explain this, path.
To get people to turn themselves into this UNDC willfully, you must withhold so much aid that the military leaders start feeling hungry.
Beautiful. That's a problem with opening government. That doesn't prove why you captured them. But Ayal explains that the UNDOS has people and a military force in Syria already, which is why they do not need al-Shara's permit. It's also why al-Shara is biased and leveraged by the US because he wants to get the legal justification of the UNDOS that already has a mandate to be on Syria's border with Israel. Now let's talk about what opposition say happens in these communities. The problem with the assumption that there are many local leaders is that it's just not true that there's anyone that supports Syria, that supports Assad or these ISIS factions already. First of all, notice that even the people who were Syria aligned have been betrayed. Iran and Russia left them. Assad fled the country and refused to weaponize military forces in order to stop al-Shara's invasion into the south. Even the allies that they talk about hate Assad at this point. Secondly, we also think that the specific individuals we talk about, ISIS assailants in Rojava prisons, that you need this information in order to catch, have hurt the entirety of Syria except because they're based in Iraqi settlements. They are not coming from communities within Syria. These are people who have used chemical weapons in the past. These are people who have murdered civilians. Flip this argument. You are more scared of al-Shara if he doesn't prosecute them. His past connections to Hayat al-Sham means that you assume he is going to be an Islamist himself because he's not doing enough to stop the ones who have murdered our dear loved ones, which is the majority of Syria's populations. This trust actually increases on their side. Finally, weigh against both top half teams. Yes, what happened in Syria is awful, but ISIS assailants not only hurt much more victims per opening government's metric on many other countries, they also have an active threat. These are military leaders. These are strategists. These are IRGC experts that can be embedded into Yemen, into Iraqi militias. For all those reasons, Felipe.
Thank you very much for that speech and very high quality opposition voice. Don't discuss, just